So, major studios all have their way of rendering out lighting passes, and after a few years as a compositor, I've definitely got my favourite, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. So I'm actually going to break it into two parts. The first part will be all inside of Blender, just setting up our scene, getting it ready to be rendered. In the second video, we'll be rendering out our animation and finally bringing it into Nuke. And I'm going to show you a few sort of examples of how you would use the sort of things that we're going to set up. Let's jump into Blender. So I've got a super simple scene, just a few objects animating on a ground plane. I've also got these two lights, and I've also set up an HDRI in our scene as well. The first thing we're going to do is to separate these two lights into their own collections. That way we have the ability to turn them off and on when we render out our images. So the first one will go into a collection, we'll call it key light, and the second one we'll put into a collection called fill light. So now when we actually render these out, we'll have the ability to turn them off and on when we need to. So we can turn the fill light and the key light off, so we're left with just our HDRI. And we'll come to how to turn this HDRI off a bit later. But the first thing we want to do is to set up our view layers, which is how we're going to render them separately at the end. So the first one we want is our beauty, which is going to contain everything that's uniform across every pass. It's going to contain all our lights and our data passes in the end. The next one we want is a key pass, and then we want a fill. We'll also need an environment pass, and finally, which we'll combine with our beauty later, is a data pass. So once we have these set up, we can actually go through and properly set up the settings we want in each of our view layers. So as I said, the beauty layer is going to contain everything, all the lights, and eventually our data pass. But first thing, we need to set up what passes we want inside this beauty render. We don't want a Z pass, we'll be creating our own later on. And the only other thing we want in our beauty pass for now is our crypto matte objects. And we don't need this many layers, as it's a very simple scene, we don't have much in there. The other thing we want is denoising data, which is always good to have. So the next one we want to do is the environment pass. So this is going to just be our HDRI. So we want to turn off our key and fill light. So that way this is going to only contain our HDRI light. And then we can go in and set up this the same as the beauty, except for this pass we're going to have our direct indirect color and also our direct indirect glossy. I don't tend to use the color glossy. I don't think I've ever used it, so I just don't bother rendering it. No need for rendering things that I know I'm not going to really use. Also turning on denoising data. So the next one is our key light. This one, obviously we don't want to turn off our key light, we want to keep that one on, but we do want to turn off our fill light. Now the other thing we also want to turn off is our HDRI. And to do that, if you just scroll down to the bottom to filter, we can actually just tick off the environment. So now we just have our key light lighting our scene. And once again, just like our environment, we're going to turn off Z, turn on denoising data, click these on, and that is it for this pass. We're going to do the same for the fill, to recreate exactly the same thing, this time without our key light, turning off our environment, turning off our Z pass, turning on denoising data, direct indirect color, direct indirect, and that is all. So the final one we need to do is our data pass. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Nothing too complicated. We don't actually need any passes, any standard passes, that is, for this render layer. However, we do need to set up a material that we're going to put onto every object in our scene. So to do that, we'll just jump into our shading editor. You can click on whichever object you want. Just do it on here. We just want to create a new material. We'll call this material data. We can get rid of these two default nodes, and we'll put in an AOV output. In fact, we'll need 3 of these. So if we just duplicate these, so this data pass is going to be containing position pass information. And to do that, we need a geometry node, which is going to give us our position pass, and that will go into here. You can see what that kind of looks like. It's going to look like just a bunch of colors, but it'll make sense once we actually start using these passes, what they're sort of useful for. The other node we need is a texture coordinate node, and that's going to give us our position object pass and our position camera pass. And these look like this. So that's a position object. It's going to look very similar to the position world at this point, but it is different. And our position camera, which is going to look very different. We also need to give these a name. So the first one is going to be our position world pass. We can just shorten that to PW. Our position object pass, and our position camera pass. Now, to let Blender know that what we want to render out, we actually need to come into our passes and add in our shader AOVs here. And so Blender knows what to talk to. We need to give it the same name as we did in the material itself. So this way Blender knows exactly what we want to render out. Also, you'll notice that since we've changed this material here, it's actually going to change it in all of our other passes as well, which we obviously don't want. This is going to render out just completely black. There's no color information here whatsoever. So we need to take this back to what it originally was, and we need another way of applying the material to all the objects. Now you can imagine if you had 100 objects in your scene, going through and applying this data material to every one of them would be a very painful process. But there is a much simpler way. That's if we come down here to our override tab, and if we just select our material data pass, you won't see anything in the viewport unless you're in rendered view, and then you'll see even less in your viewport. But this is actually what we want. You can see now that our data pass has been applied to every material in our scene. In fact, we don't want it on our beauty pass, we want it on our data pass, which would be much better. Just make sure we haven't messed up this any other way. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so now we're actually all ready to render. I'm just going to render a single frame at this point, just to make sure that we've done everything correctly. And in the next video, we'll go in and render the full animation. Okay, so we can see here that Blender's put us into our composite tab here. But if we jump into our beauty, it's going to look the same. But we have all our denoising data, which is good. Our environment light is going to be without our 2 lights. And we're also going to have our all our different passes. Again, this is what we want. Key light should just be our key light. Our fill light and our data pass, which is going to be black, which is correct. That's what we want. But we'll see that we have now our position passes. It's going to be a bit more obvious, the sort of the differences between them now that we've rendered it out. So this is our position world pass, which is, it's going to be completely relative to the origin of Blender, which X, Y, and Z corresponds to RGB. Then we have our position object, which is similar, but it's per object, so you can see all our objects have sort of similar colors in the same corners. So red's at the front, blue, we've got the back left, and the same for our ground plane, so each object is sort of identical. And the last one we have is position camera, which is, it's kind of a hard one to sort of visualize because it just looks like it's sort of 2D. The easiest one to see, and this is why we didn't render our Z pass, is because if we come into, where do we want to be, color management, if we expose down, you can actually see that we've created a depth pass with this, and it's relative to the camera. So if the camera zooms in, so if it's, let's say it's 5 pixels here, and the camera zooms in closer, it'll go down to 2 pixels. So it's a real world sort of value. So if this is 5 meters away, it'll be a value of 5, and if the camera pushes in or zooms in, then it'll get closer. So let's say it comes to 2 meters, this will change to a value of 2. So if we put this back, so that's all our passes done. So in the next video we'll actually jump into the compositing tab, so we'll set up all our renders and how we want them to be exported from here, and then we'll jump into Nuke. So I hope you found this somewhat useful. Using methods like this definitely saves studios so much time when it comes to hitting deadlines, and you'll understand why in the next video. It's a really good way to work. If you did find it useful, don't forget to leave a like on the video, and if you do want to see the next part, consider subscribing so that way you know as soon as I upload it. Alright, see you later.